So, well, let's see. Let's pick up where one of the places I left off yesterday, dealing with, yesterday I talked about music a bit. Talked about You're So Vain, and talked about Smoke on the Water being, two songs by artists that most people don't know a whole lot about those artists, but they know those songs, and those songs pretty much in the popular light, whether or not the artists are. I mean, everybody knows who Deep Purple is, but who can name more than two songs by Deep Purple? Of course, there are, quite a few fans out there, but in the broad population, I would say probably not many people are familiar with their work outside of their one or two hits. And Carly Simon about the same, right? I mean, I've looked into Carly Simon, and I can't, off the top of my head, think of a second song. I'm sure there are some that, if I were reminded of, I'm like, oh yeah, I know that song. But off the top of my head, nothing, a blank. And that's not to, demean her as an artist or anything like that. That's not at all what I mean. It's just sometimes people get in the public eye, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes a group becomes popular within a specialized community, and sometimes they don't. I, for instance, could tell you a lot of, REM songs, a lot of Depeche Mode songs, a lot of Joy Division, a lot of Radiohead, quite a few Frank Zappa songs, all kinds of metal bands. Listened to quite a few of those. But, when we get beyond, the one or two hits, or the things that may have made it on, like, the radio, or might have been something that was in a movie or something, there are a lot of people who, may not really know some of these songs, or maybe even the bands. Like, there are people who probably have no idea who Joy Division is, or Morphine, one of my favorite bands. There are probably people who, they might know a band like Modest Mouse because of their last couple of albums that were kind of popular, but their material before that is probably a blank to most people. And that's okay. I mean, that's the way things go. The same thing's true about all kinds of people. Like, people talk about how much of a creative genius Kanye West was when he started out, before he kind of lost everything and went crazy. I don't mean money-wise, but just lost all credibility. And he was a great artist. But, outside of a handful of songs like Gold Digger, are people able to actually name the songs? I think his albums sold pretty well, but, and that's an interesting thing. Let's say 1 million copies. Well, if an album sells 1 million copies, that's, in America, that's 1 out of every 320 people in America own the album. That doesn't necessarily seem like something that's hugely popular, but a 1 million album seller is still an insanely popular album. So it's interesting how that works in terms of just the raw numbers. And of course, books are the same. I mean, everybody knows that, say, Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick, and everybody knows that Moby Dick's about a big whale. But what do people know beyond that? Even if they've read the book, they probably don't know a whole lot more, because the plot. These guys get on a boat and go around trying to catch this big white whale. Yeah, there are some details, but that's basically the plot of Moby Dick. And, okay, great. What else did Melville write? Well, some people may have heard of Billy Budd. Okay, what else did he write? Well, maybe people know Benito Cereno, or Bartleby the Scrivener, or, some of his other fiction. Maybe somebody's heard of The Confidence Man, his last actual novel. Or maybe they learned somewhere that he was a poet and wrote some poems about the Civil War, I think called Battle Pieces, I think that's what it's called. I'm not a fan of his poetry. But, Moby Dick was not his first novel, nor his last. He wrote, I think, 6 novels. Who's read Umu? Who's read Marty? Who's read Redcoat or White Jacket? Um, you know, uh, so you know, all of this works that way. Nathaniel Hawthorne, contemporary of Melville, he wrote The House of the Seven Gables. He wrote The Scarlet Letter. He also wrote things like The Marble Faun, and he wrote some interesting short stories. And people know some of that material, but nowadays, who's actually read The Scarlet Letter? And I have to say, The Scarlet Letter is not my cup of tea. I very much remember back in the day, the church that we went to. We were one of those churches that, we went to church almost every night, it seems. And I remember, we had that book that had, was it Huck Finn or Tom Sawyer? It had Billy Budd in it, and it had The Scarlet Letter, and it had The Red Badge of Courage, maybe? I think The Red Badge of Courage. Anyway, it was these 4 American classics that we were supposed to read. And I remember sitting in the hall of that church trying to read The Scarlet Letter and literally falling asleep about every single paragraph. And not because I was sleep deprived or necessarily tired or anything. It's just not Melville, Hawthorne style. Man, that was just hard for me. Now, I don't know why. Some books are hard for me, some books are not. Like I talked earlier about reading, well, I wrote poems about reading Nietzsche, reading Beyond Good and Evil. And I love Beyond Good and Evil. And, he's got another book at home, which is a book of his aphorisms called Will to Power, which is, I think collected over his career, or maybe it's the uncollected ones, I'm not really sure. And then he's got a couple of others. I think he's got a book called The Birth of Tragedy or something like that. Anyway, I've read at least 3, maybe 4 different books by Nietzsche. Now, the famous one, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the one that a lot of people read, the very narrative one about this Zarathustra guy who wanders around and teaches people. Deadly boring. Oh my Lord, that is a deadly book. I could not make it through. Couldn't do it. I have tried to read that book. I don't even know how many times. Can't do it. And it's not the period. I mean, Clarissa by Samuel Richardson, written 100 years before all that stuff. 1,400-page book. Massive, massive, massive. One of the largest single-volume novels in English. I read that thing and enjoyed it quite a bit. Of course, there's Jane Austen and the Brontes, and later in the 19th century, excuse me, there's Dickens and other people like that who I enjoy quite a bit. I've read Middlemarch by Eliot and other Victorian novelists as well. And that material I enjoy quite a bit, and even some of the American contemporaries like James Fenimore Cooper, and then some of the early 20th stuff like Theodore Dreiser, all that stuff. I've read it and enjoyed it, and of course, being in grad school for English, you read things that you don't necessarily enjoy, things you don't necessarily like. You struggle through them if they're boring or dull or whatever. But for some reason, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, just not for me. And, another book I've had a really hard time reading is Crime and Punishment, which is kind of unusual because it's the Dostoevsky a lot of people start with. And I managed to fail. I failed with War and Peace, too. I've read basically almost to the page half of War and Peace twice. Never made it through. Anna Karenina, loved it. Read all of it. Dostoevsky, The Brothers Karamazov, which is supposed to be a harder book and more obtuse than Crime and Punishment. Loved it. Made it through that one. And I read one of Dostoevsky's other books, I think The Idiot. I'm not really sure which one because, the titles kind of blur a little bit, but loved that one too. So, just sometimes certain books just, I don't know, they don't do it for me. But part of the point here is that, all these things, how much do we really know about Dostoevsky from reading one novel? How much do we know about, say, the Beatles, if all we listen to are the hits, or, we know Sergeant Pepper, but, we don't know, Please Please Me, and we don't know With the Beatles, and Beatles for Sale, and those kinds of things. Or even, outside of the Beatles, how about the rest of the Liverpool scene, the other Mercy Beat bands? Not many of them are even, I don't know, known nowadays. But yeah, so, I could talk about these kinds of things, and maybe it'd be interesting. I don't know. We shall see. Anyway, that's enough for today.